The earliest arrival of African Americans in Forsyth County is tied to the Moravians. During the 1770s, the Moravians brought black slaves from the Caribbean to Salem to work for them. Since individual Moravians were not permitted to own slaves, they were owned by the Moravian Church, which rented them out to the whites. In the 1770s, Jacob Meyer, who managed the Salem Tavern, brought his slaves Peter and Louisa with him, thus becoming one of the earliest individual owner of slaves in Salem. The Moravians, like the Quakers, treated their slaves somewhat humane. They wanted to convert them to Christianity. Several slaves were converted to Christianity and attended the Moravian Church. In 1771, Sam, later known as Johann Samuel, was the first African American baptized by the Moravians in North Carolina. At first, black church members worshiped together in Moravian churches with whites and were buried in the same graveyard, God's Acre. Eventually, all of this changed because of pressure from the surrounding white community. By 1789, African Americans were segregated in the church and had to sit in the back. By 1800, blacks were not allowed to attend the Moravian church. African Americans were also excluded from being buried in the graveyard. According to some records, Peter Oliver was the last known black buried in God's Acre. This was in 1822. In 1823, about 30 African Americans built themselves a log church. The Salem Female Missionary Society paid for it and taught reading and writing and gave religious instructions in the church. The church had its own graveyard. After the North Carolina General Assembly passed a law in 1830 banning the teaching of slaves, the society had to stop giving them instructions. Because of increased attendance in the church, a larger one was needed. In 1861, a larger brick church was built. A white minister was in charge. As time passed, the Moravians became more and more like their white neighbors. By 1847, the church abolished all bans on buying or owning slaves by individuals. By 1850, Moravian Francis Fries, owner of Salem Cotton Company, owned 23 slaves. And in 1860, he owned 47 slaves. Fries did pay his slaves, and some even had side businesses, such as chair making, broom making, and selling tobacco plugs. In 1856, the Moravian Church passed a ruling that anyone could own a business or land and reside in Salem. Interestingly enough, 5 major companies, some using African American labor, were on the outside of Salem. The establishments were Salem Cotton Company, Nissan Wagon Works, Fry's Woolen Mills, F&H Fry's Company, and Spock Wagon Works. Gradually, both slaves and free African Americans settled outside of Salem in the new town of Winston. Just before the Civil War in both Salem and Winston, African Americans only numbered a little more than 300. During the 1870s, Richard Joshua Reynolds came to Winston and opened a tobacco factory. Within 4 decades, R.J. Reynolds had 100 buildings and more than 10,000 mostly African American workers. Because of a shortage of workers, Reynolds sent trains to eastern North Carolina and South Carolina to recruit workers for the factories. African Americans also came from Virginia to work in Reynolds and other factories. By 1900, more than 5,000 African Americans lived in Salem and Winston. 10 years later, that figure more than doubled. The African Americans that worked in the factories lived within walking distance of the factories. This was the early beginnings of black neighborhoods. African Americans also worked in foundries and furniture factories. Besides factory workers, there were maids, janitors, cooks, gardeners, woodworkers, and insurance agents. There were also professionals such as physicians, druggists, attorneys, ministers, teachers, business persons, funeral homeowners, barbers, and printers. After the Civil War, African Americans in Winston, like those in other towns and cities in the state, also participated in the political process. In 1881, they helped elect Israel Clement to the Winston Town Commission. Although Clement was the first African American town commissioner, at least 8 other blacks were also elected to that body. During the 1890s, Simon Green Atkins was one of the most influential African Americans in Winston. He came to Winston from Livingstone College to be principal of the Depot Street Colored Graded School. In 1891, Atkins asked the Board of Trade for help in starting an African American college. He also suggested that a suburb be developed near the college for the growing black professionals. The board agreed. A year later, 11 prominent white leaders formed Inside Land and Improvement Company, and it purchased the land that became Columbian Heights. Simon Green Atkins and his family were some of the first residents of the suburb. During the same year, Atkins started Slater Industrial Academy. The school was named after John F. Slater, a white philanthropist from New York who donated money to the school, along with $2,000 from the African American townspeople and $500 donated by R.J. Reynolds. Other whites such as Henry F. Fries and William A. Blair also contributed not only money to the college, but also their time. The land for the school was deeded to it by the Inside Company. Classes were held in one room, frame building with 25 students and one teacher. The first permanent building, Lamson Hall, was built by the students at Slater Academy in 1896. In 1895, Atkins resigned his principalship at Depot Street School and worked full-time at Slater Normal and Industrial School, as it was then called. The state of North Carolina supervised the school, and it received a legislative charter and became part of the state college system in 1897. In 1895, the state purchased the property and put the school under its full control. The school now became the Slater Industrial and State Normal School. The school's name changed again in 1925, and it was now called the Winston-Salem Teachers College. During the same year, the General Assembly made it a 4-year college, and it began offering teaching certificates for teachers in elementary schools. It was the first African American college in the United States to grant degrees for teachers in elementary education. Simon Green Atkins served as president from 1892 to 1904 and 1913 to 1934. He died on June 28, 1934. The history of African Americans in Winston-Salem after 1890 to a larger degree is tied to the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company because it was the largest employer of blacks in the country. Moreover, generation after generation of African American families worked for Reynolds Tobacco Company. Most blacks in Winston were affected directly or indirectly by the company. African American businesses, churches, social organizations, etc., were greatly impacted by Reynolds workers. Over the years, black-white relationships were not what it could have been in Winston-Salem, but it was perhaps better than some towns in the South. A number of events over the years strained that relationship. In 1895, a race riot broke out when a white police officer was shot and killed by an African American youth. It was rumored that whites were going to break into the jail, where the youth was being held, and lynch him. About 400 blacks marched in front of the jail on August 11, 1895, and refused to leave. The sheriff's department, with the support of a militia unit, fired on the crowd, and several African Americans were killed. The blacks defended themselves against the militia. The riot lasted about 8 hours. The youth was not lynched, thanks to the efforts of the African Americans and others. Perhaps Winston-Salem's worst race riot in its history occurred in November of 1918. The arrest of an African American man for allegedly killing a white man, robbing and raping his wife, sparked the riot. Several thousand whites gathered in front of the downtown courthouse and attempted to break into the jail where the suspect was held and lynch him. The mayor called out the home guard, and the white mob had a confrontation with it. The mob broke into downtown stores and stole guns and went into the African American section of town and fired on some of the residents. Things got so bad that federal troops and militia were called in from Greensboro, Charlotte, and Raleigh. They stopped the violence by patrolling the streets and dispersed the mob. One source said 6 to 20 blacks were killed by the white mob and several other whites were wounded. It was said that one white man was killed by a mob of blacks and several whites may also have been wounded. During the 1940s, the African American workers at R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company went on strike against the tobacco giant. Local 22 of the Tobacco Workers International Union had organized the workers in 1944. Black union workers at Reynolds met on April 27, 1947, and decided to strike on May 1st. The strike lasted until June 7. The workers and union did win some concessions. Even the great Paul Robeson came to Winston-Salem and gave his support to the union workers. The union helped increase voter registration for African Americans from a low of 300 to a high of 3,000. Because of alleged communist infiltration of the union leadership, The strike ceased and the Union was under federal investigation to see if communists were controlling the Union. The investigation did not find that communists controlled the Union. By this time, however, the Union lost its power and unionization at R.J. Reynolds was no more. One other outcome of this 1947 strike was the Union helped African Americans to elect the Reverend Kenneth R. Williams to the Board of Aldermen, making him the first in North Carolina and probably the South to an elected board in the 20th century. From this point on, African Americans in Forsyth County began to be elected to other boards and were appointed to public positions. Race riots also occurred in the Twin Cities during the late 1960s. One riot happened on November 2, 1967, and lasted for 3 days. This riot occurred when a black man was killed in a struggle with a white police officer. It was stated that the African American rioters, many of them were young people, caused nearly 100 fires and did about $750,000 in property damages. In conclusion, it can be seen that African Americans contributed greatly to the building and development of Winston-Salem. Although blacks have made great strides in the political and economic sphere of the city, socially they have the most segregated housing pattern of all the state's largest cities. In spite of African Americans' concerns about the city's segregated housing pattern, grievances against the police department, a rising crime rate, and new leadership, they still feel that Winston-Salem will come to terms with their concerns and the city will find amicable solutions to these concerns. In short, African Americans appear to be optimistic about the future of Winston-Salem and their role in it.